Hey, welcome back to Lesson 2 of the IYCA Youth Fitness Specialist Level 1, Second Edition. This lesson is entitled The Developing Athlete Part 1, so if you're following along in the textbook, and I hope you are, this will be the first half of Chapter 2. So without further ado, let's get rolling. So today we're going to look at the nervous system and its impact on motor development, as well as the process of motor development. Now, it's critically important for anyone working with young athletes to understand just how young athletes are different from their adult counterparts. In Lesson 1, we talked about how young athletes should not utilize watered-down adult programming. And this lesson is really going to pinpoint and highlight some of the reasons why this is particularly true. All right, so like we said, children are not just little adults. There are significant differences that basically should influence the way we train these young athletes. Neurologically, they are vastly different. Skeletally and muscularly, they are different as well. So that leads to structural differences. Consider, for instance, just how significant the lever lengths are in a young athlete who's 4'2", and how as that athlete grows to a height of 6 foot plus, just how very much those biomechanics change. You also consider the center of mass changes. Relatively speaking, young people have a head size and mass that's larger relative to their body, so that alters their center of mass. There are also significant hormone differences. In particular, testosterone's influence on the young athlete's ability to add fat-free mass is a huge influencer of the way we train. There are countless other ways, but I implore you, as you're developing your training for young athletes, don't look at elite level athletes training programs. For years, there was a program marketed by a trainer of the stars, quote unquote, who worked with NBA athletes, and it was a vertical jump training program. Well, the reality is a 10-year-old does not have the same kind of musculoskeletal structure, neurologic control that an NBA player does. So to think that putting a 10-year-old on an NBA jump training program is beneficial is really kind of laughable when you think about it. So that said, we want to figure out if we shouldn't use adult programming. Well, what should we use? We don't just want to leave you in a quandary. Now, most fundamentally, the nervous system can be broken down into two basic divisions: the CNS, central nervous system, and the PNS, peripheral nervous system. Now, the CNS, we typically think of it as basically the brain and spinal cord. That's the simplest way to consider it. This system is fully formed at birth. The number of cells is consistent. However, it's not fully interconnected. And that's where training and where exposure to variable stimuli can really assist and help young people develop more fully. The PNS consists of the sensory neurons, the ganglia, the motor neurons, basically everything else. And this provides sensory information as well as protection. So we'll look at some of these protective mechanisms in just a minute. Now, in considering how movement occurs and how it is regulated, interpreted, altered in response to stimuli, then we really need to look at it systematically. And systemically, actually, is probably the correct word there. So we want to train the entire system. Now, Brown's business analogy really ties us into some known examples so that we can kind of see how these different components work together. In the diagram in your text as well as here, you can see the descending pathways as the dark black lines, and basically you can kind of think about that as a top-down approach. And then the ascending pathways are our sensory afferents. That's nerve impulses traveling from the periphery up into the brain. Okay, so there's really 4 primary areas that we are going to concern ourselves with for the purposes of this chapter. The cortex and basal ganglia, the cerebellum and the motor cortex, the brainstem and spinal cord, and the muscles and the sensory receptors. So let's take a look at these. Okay, so the cortex and basal ganglia act as the control center, so to speak. That's the executive boardroom. This is where movement is planned, where things are considered before any action is taken, and the motor plan is formed here in this executive boardroom. Now, if we follow that out, the cerebellum and the motor cortex function as middle management. That they serve to further refine and revise the motor plan. Okay. From there, we then go to the brainstem and the spinal cord, and we can see them as on-site supervisors. So going back to this business analogy, they're basically there to assist in the execution of the plan. Their proximity to the prime movers is critical because that close proximity allows them to take an active role in the process. So for instance, in an event like a pain arc reflex, the brainstem, or rather the spinal cord, allows that quick synapse to take place so that that pain signal does not have to be interpreted in the brain. So in other words, it's faster. Okay, so we don't have to interpret that burning sensation as pain. Oh, I should move my hand away. By then we've already incurred tissue damage. We don't want that. Okay, so on-site supervisors basically have an opportunity to intervene and assist in the execution of the plan. And then the last step is the muscles and the sensory receptors, and these function as the workers and the secretaries. They carry out the motor plan, but they do still have a quote-unquote say in the process. So think about this. For instance, if we are holding a weight in our hand, or let's say we're using a resistance band, probably a better example, and as we curl that resistance band up, say we're doing a bicep curl. I'm an integrative guy. I'm not going to do isolation exercises, but for the sake of this example, we'll say that's what I'm doing. And as that resistance band, it's under my foot, and I'm stretching that up toward my shoulder into elbow flexion. That band is stretching tighter and tighter and tighter. Well, because it is a submaximal load, because it is being applied at a relatively slow rate, then the muscle spindle fibers embedded within the muscle itself serve to further activate that prime mover, the biceps brachii primarily, in response to that sensation. So in that respect, it serves to recruit additional muscle fibers. Now, on the other hand, let's say I'm working on bicep strength again, and suddenly a 45-pound plate falls from above my head, and I try to catch it. Well, the magnitude as well as the rate at which my muscle is going to be loaded is going to trigger not the muscle spindle fiber, but rather the tendon organ. Now, the best way to remember this is that the muscle spindle fiber is within the muscle. What's surrounding it is additional muscle fibers that it can call into action. The Golgi tendon organ is embedded within the tendon. It is surrounded by non-contractile structure. So basically the only thing it can do to protect the body is to shut the muscle down. So it's inhibitory. It's a protective mechanism. Okay. So if we trigger GTO, we are going to get inhibition in that prime mover because both the load as well as the rate of loading are excessive. And if we tried to work against that force, we could end up with an avulsion of the tendon or a complete rupture of the muscle or who knows what else. Alright, so first we discussed the divisions of the nervous system. Now we're going to look at the process of motor development. Now the first thing that I can't emphasize enough, and you'll see it throughout this lesson, is that the age ranges that are provided for you here I want you to hold those very loosely. And what I mean by that is there is significant variability from child to child, from person to person. And although these age ranges are generally accurate, there are always exceptions to the rule. So treat what you see, don't just assume that because an athlete has a chronological age of a certain amount that they should be in a particular period. Okay, so we're going to look at each of these in turn. Reflexive, fundamental patterns, context-specific, skilled, and compensatory periods. Alright, so the reflexive period, this stage is going to be characterized by the expression of primitive reflexes that are essential to our survival. So a sucking reflex, a rooting reflex, palmar grasp, we're going to see these up to about the age of 12 months. As the nervous system continues to develop those interconnections, then these reflexes will be repressed oftentimes. Okay. From there we go to our pre-adaptive phase. Here we're going to see improved postural control. In particular, babies have big heads, and it's critical for them to develop the necessary extensor strength in the neck in order to be able to lift their head, and then from there they have to learn to balance that thing on a relatively unstable base, and that's their body. Okay, so through the pre-adaptive phase they will develop postural control and basically begin crawling and ambulating eventually. Progression through this period does vary pretty substantially, but this can be enhanced if we provide the child with varied time and additional opportunities for movement. Things like varying stimuli and making the young person reach for objects and basically encouraging them to ambulate more and more can speed the process somewhat. However, there is significant variability here. Alright, so that brings us to the fundamental patterns phase. And this is usually associated with early childhood. Say, okay, so between the ages of 2 and 5. Here we'll see the development of basic locomotor skills and object manipulation. So they'll begin to express motor behaviors such as running, jumping, hopping, and then for object manipulation we'll see things like throwing, catching, being able to strike objects with other objects. And what Dr. Stodden's research is starting to point out is these fundamental patterns as early as the age of 2 to 5. Appropriate development of these patterns can be linked to markers of health well into adulthood. Okay, so the take-home message for the youth fitness specialist here is you want to market this. You want to shout it from the rooftops just how important movement experiences are for young athletes. Does this mean you're going to have a 5-year-old conditioning program? No, but structuring play opportunities that involve locomotor skills and object manipulation can have a significant impact on how healthy these individuals are as adults. And what parent wouldn't want their child to be healthy in life? So laying that foundation here can be a critical first step. Next phase is our context-specific phase, and this is really kind of an extension of that fundamental patterns period into adolescence. We start to see those basic patterns start to be applied in a more specific environment. Okay, so for youth sports, oftentimes, for instance, here we see a young athlete dribbling. He's also cutting and changing direction. His defender is changing direction, so there's some deceleration skill, there's some acceleration skill. Okay, so this is a highly varied response, and the rate of development depends on what else is going on in the organism, in the person. Okay, so those biometric factors: how tall are they? What are their cross-sectional area of their muscles? Things like balance and coordination depend heavily on their center of mass and how they are changing over time. There's also some important psychological factors and the influence of the athlete's perception of their abilities. Okay, so generally at this period, most think they're pretty good. They haven't been told by others, or they haven't had the experience very often of being told that they're not good or that their skills are somehow lacking. And in all honesty, there probably hasn't been enough time for differentiation between their peers. So everybody's about the same, oftentimes. Okay, so that is another important aspect of this age group that we have to consider. If we give in to the tendency to overcoach, then we may undermine some of those self-efficacy issues and basically threaten the psychological well-being. Okay. As we'll talk later in the class about form-based versus outcome-based coaching, there's really two different approaches here. And giving the athlete some leeway, giving them semi-structured opportunities is by far and away the better approach for athletes in this group. That leads us into the skilled phase. With athletes in this group, they're going to spend more time and increasing effort in their sports participation. Variety is still important here. If all we do is focus on hitting a softball, then that athlete's going to become proficient, hopefully, at hitting a softball and little else. Okay, so particularly for younger athletes, high school age and below, we simply have to continue to offer opportunities to further refine and develop motor patterns head to toe, as opposed to just an extension of that context-specific phase. And then last step is the compensatory period. And here's where we start to see a declination in performance and ability related to age. As the athlete continues to maybe lose the ability to produce force or the ability to react as quickly as they could perhaps earlier in their career, then the more pronounced this compensatory period becomes. They may actually change their game. We see this oftentimes in the NFL. If you look at an athlete like a Peyton Manning, one of the better examples might be John Elway. Early in his career, he changed the game because he was a mobile quarterback. He would move around a lot in the pocket. He was able to elude defenders. Late in his career, when he had lost foot speed, he was still effective, but he changed his game. It was compensatory in his approach. He became much more of a pocket passer. So that's more of kind of a macroscopic view of how those compensatory patterns develop. Here we're talking specifically. Maybe he lacks the foot speed he once had. Are there things that he's able to do differently to make up for lack of fast twitch muscle fiber activity, for instance? Okay. All right. Well, that's a pretty quick lesson this week, but want to give you plenty of time to read through the text and make sure that you've had ample opportunity to kind of wrestle with these concepts, make sure you're comfortable with all of the new language and verbiage that you're being exposed to. Next time we will complete our discussion of the developing athlete, and I encourage you to read ahead and come prepared. Thanks again. This is Dr. Toby Brooks signing off.